David Smith wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to find in a place like Area 51. At 48, he was a former specialist in covert technologies, the type of person who cracked things no one else could. But that was in the past. After his last mission years ago, he walked away from it all, vowing never to return. That mission had left its mark, made him question whether all the risk was worth it. Now, he lived in a trailer in the middle of the Nevada desert, where the biggest challenge was deciding whether to watch a baseball game or read an old book. But the past has a way of catching up, doesn't it? On a scorching August afternoon, the phone rang, shattering the silence David had grown to love. He hesitated, staring at the device like it was an intruder. When he finally picked it up, the voice on the other end was familiar and unwelcome. "David, it's Director Wells," the voice said, carrying a mix of authority and exhaustion. David's stomach twisted. He knew this wasn't a casual call. "I'm out, Wells. You know that?" David replied, trying to sound firm. But Wells wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. "This isn't a request, David. You're the only one who can handle what we found. Close your eyes for a second and feel the weight of that. Being pulled back to a place you swore you'd left behind, knowing that if you go, there's no guarantee you'll come out whole." That's what David felt. He tried to fight it, to tell himself he could ignore the call. But curiosity had always been his weakness. It's why he'd taken so many risky missions in the past, and why, hours later, he was driving down a deserted highway, the blistering Nevada sun glinting off his car's hood. Area 51 loomed on the horizon like a memory he'd rather forget, with its security gates and a heavy air of secrets. When he arrived, the guards sized him up with a mix of respect and suspicion. David had seen those looks before, the kind that said he was a legend, but also a relic. He passed through the security barriers, each step echoing on the concrete floor. In the main hangar, Director Wells was waiting, leaning against a table cluttered with monitors and files. "You haven't changed a bit, David," Wells said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's cut to the chase, Wells. Why am I here?" David asked, crossing his arms. He didn't want small talk. He wanted answers. Wells straightened up, gesturing toward a narrow hallway leading deep into the base. "Follow me," he said, and David felt a chill he couldn't explain. The hallway was cold, with flickering fluorescent lights casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. After passing through multiple layers of reinforced security, retina scanners, codes, armed guards, they reached a small, dim room. At its center was an object that didn't belong, a stone gateway, 10 feet tall, covered in symbols that looked ancient and strange. David frowned, feeling a low hum vibrating in the air. "What is this?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. "About a year ago, we found it buried in the desert," Wells explained, choosing his words carefully. "It activates every 18 hours, and when it opens, it doesn't lead anywhere on this earth." David almost laughed, thinking it was a joke, but Wells' expression, that of a man who hadn't slept in days, said otherwise. "You'll see for yourself," Wells added, checking his watch. 20 minutes to go. David stepped closer to the gate, curiosity swelling in his chest. The surface was rough, like it had been carved centuries ago, but there was something alive about it. The symbols pulsed with an energy he couldn't explain. He glanced at Wells, trying to mask his unease. "What's on the other side?" he asked, his voice steady but with a slight tremor. "So far, just glimpses," Wells replied, hesitant, "but enough to know it's different. Landscapes that don't exist here, things we can't explain." David felt a knot in his stomach. He didn't know what awaited him, but one thing was clear. That gate wasn't just a door. It was an invitation, and he wasn't sure he wanted to accept it. David stood in front of the gate, the low hum filling the room like a whisper he couldn't ignore. Wells stepped back, gesturing to a technician who began setting up equipment. "You'll need this," Wells said, handing David a wrist device that looked like a futuristic watch but felt heavier. "It's a temporal anchor. It'll keep you synced to our side. And these lenses," he pointed to a pair of lightweight goggles, "will help you process whatever's out there." The technician fitted the lenses over David's eyes, and he blinked, feeling his vision sharpen, though with a slight distortion at the edges. "How much time do I have?" David asked, try and keep his voice steady. Wells checked his watch. The gate stays open for 30 minutes. Then it closes for 18 hours until the next window. David felt the weight of that information. 30 minutes to explore the unknown. And after that, he'd be stuck on the other side for nearly a full day. As the gate began to glow, a pulsing red light emanating from its center, David felt a tingling on his skin, as if the air was charged with electricity. He glanced at Wells, searching for some hint of reassurance. But the director's face was a mask of tension. "Good luck, David," Wells said, but the words rang hollow. The gate stabilized, and its center transformed into a window to another world. Dense vegetation with dark red leaves that seemed to glow, and a sky that wasn't blue, but a shifting grayish hue. David took a deep breath, feeling his heart pound against his ribs. Take a step forward and feel the void swallow you. That's how it felt as he crossed through the gate. A wave of cold washed over him, and suddenly he was on the other side, the hum of the gate fading behind him. The air was humid, carrying a sweet metallic scent he couldn't place. He looked around, the lenses adjusting his vision to the dim light, and saw tall trees with thick, textured trunks, each red leaf pulsing as if alive. He activated the wrist device, which displayed a countdown, 18 hours until the gate reopened. The silence around him was almost suffocating, but then he heard something, a faint rustling, as if something moved in the undergrowth. David froze, his eyes scanning for the source, but he saw nothing. "Focus, David," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the chill creeping up his neck. As he pushed through a path lined with ferns the size of doors, he began noticing details that unsettled him. There were marks on the trees, symbols that looked hand-carved but weathered by time. He approached one, tracing the pattern with his fingers. It was cold, almost like stone, yet the symbols felt familiar, like something from a dream he couldn't quite recall. The deeper he ventured into the forest, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. The air felt heavier, as if the environment itself were breathing. David paused to check his wrist device, but the screen flickered, showing a slight fluctuation in time. That's not normal, he thought, a knot forming in his stomach. He didn't know it yet, but time in this place didn't follow the same rules as on Earth. Then he heard a sound that made him stop, a whisper low and indistinct, like voices he couldn't make out. It came from all directions, blending with the rustling leaves. David spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing, just the trees and a silence that seemed to mock him. The lenses in his eyes began to flicker, as if struggling to process something they couldn't comprehend. He pressed on, tried to ignore the whispers, but they grew louder, clearer. Disjointed words like "you" and "here" started to take shape, and David felt a rising panic. He stopped in a small clearing, where he found something that made him freeze. A footprint in the ground, almost human but with elongated, narrow toes, as if someone had tried to mimic a human shape and failed. David stared at the footprint, his heart racing, and realized he wasn't alone. Something, or someone, had been there before, and from the sound of the whispers, now closer than ever, he had a sinking feeling it was still nearby, watching his every move. David stood in the clearing, staring at the strange footprint in the ground, his heart pounding so loudly he almost didn't hear the whispers. They were clearer now, forming sentences he could understand. "You don't belong here." He spun around, his eyes searching for any movement. But the trees around him seemed to close in, their red leaves pulsing as if breathing. He tried to convince himself it was just his imagination, but the lenses in his eyes flickered incessantly, as if something were interfering. He took a step back, tripping over a root, and that's when he saw it. A series of markings etched into a nearby rock, symbols identical to those on a gate at Area 51. But there was something new, a pattern that looked like a message. David approached, the wrist device vibrating on his arm, and traced the symbols with his fingers. They were fresher, less weathered, as if someone had made them recently. As he studied the markings, the whispers shifted, growing more urgent. "You've been here before," they said, and David felt an inexplicable chill. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away. "That doesn't make sense," he muttered, but doubt had already taken root. He'd never been to this place, or had he? The lenses in his eyes began projecting blurry images, like flashes of memories that weren't his. Red trees, a grayish sky, and a figure that looked like him. Think for a moment about what you'd do if your own memories started betraying you. David felt the ground beneath his feet waver, as if the world around him were unraveling. He glanced at his wrist device, which now displayed an error message. Temporal sync lost. Time in this place wasn't just fluctuating. It was folding, and David realized he wasn't first come here because he'd been here before. He stumbled back, his breathing ragged, and that's when he found something that made him freeze. A metallic badge buried in the soil, covered in red moss. With trembling hands, he wiped away the dirt and read the engraved name, David Smith. It was his, or at least it seemed to be. But how? He'd never been to this world, or had he? The whispers laughed, a sound that seemed to echo inside his head. The lenses projected another image, sharper this time. David, or a version of him, running through the same forest, fear in his eyes. He saw himself carving those symbols into the rock, as a warning. But the memory wasn't his, or was it? He felt a pressure in his mind, like something trying to break in, and the whisper said, "You never left." David fell to his knees, hands clutching his head, trying to block out the voices. The truth hit him like a wave. The gate wasn't just a passage between worlds. It was a cycle, a trap that locked people in a temporal loop. David wasn't a new explorer. He was an echo of himself, caught in a cycle he'd already lived through. But how could he remember it if his mind was being rewritten each time? He looked around, the trees now seeming taller, more menacing. The whispers weren't coming from the environment. They were coming from within him, from a part of him this world had claimed. He tried to stand, but the ground tilted and the lenses in his eyes began to fail, leaving him in dimness. He wasn't just lost in this world. He was losing himself to it. David grabbed the badge, clutching it tightly, as if it were the only proof of who he was. But the false memories kept coming, each one more vivid. Him running, him screaming, him carving messages that would never be read. He realized the gate wouldn't let him escape, because he'd never escaped. He was trapped in a loop, and each time he returned, he lost more of himself. He glanced at the wrist device, the countdown still ticking down from 17 hours. But now he knew those hours wouldn't take him back to Earth. They'd take him back to the gate, to start all over again. And with each cycle, he became less him. David gripped the badge tightly, the cold metal pressing against his palm as he tried to cling to the last spark of who he was. The whispers in his head were nearly deafening now, echoing phrases he didn't want to comprehend. "You are ours." He glanced at the wrist device. The countdown read 16 hours, but he knew time no longer meant anything. He was trapped in a loop, an echo of himself, and each cycle stripped away more of his humanity. He stood, legs trembling, and resolved not to give up without a fight. "I am David Smith," he repeated to himself like a mantra as he began running back toward the gate. The trees around him seemed to shift, their red leaves pulsing faster, as if the entire world were laughing at him. But he didn't stop. He had to get back, even if it was to an Earth that wasn't his. The path felt longer than he remembered, the whispers trailing him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He stumbled over roots, the lenses in his eyes flickering incessantly, projecting flashes of memories that weren't his. Or were they? He saw himself carving more symbols, screaming at a sky that didn't answer, and realized those memories weren't just false. They were a warning. When he finally spotted the gate, its red light pulsing in the center like a living heart, David felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. He crossed through the portal without hesitation, the familiar cold enveloping him as the hum faded. He was back in Area 51, the silence of the hangar almost comforting. Wells was there, waiting, flanked by assistants in white coats holding scanners that emitted high-pitched beeps. "You're back," Wells said, but his voice carried an odd tone, almost disappointed. David frowned, panting, still clutching the badge. "What's going on, Wells?" he asked, feeling an unexplainable chill. The assistants approached, their scanners sweeping over him, and David caught something in their eyes. Not relief, but curiosity and fear. Feel the ground drop out from under you for a moment. That's how David felt when one of the assistants whispered to Wells, "He's not our David." Wells nodded, and before David could react, he felt a sting in his arm. An injection. "What are you doing?" he shouted, but his vision began to blur. his legs buckling as he collapsed to the floor. When he awoke, he wasn't in Area 51 anymore. He was in a white room, its walls pulsing like the red leaves of that other world. He tried to move but was strapped to a chair, tubes connected to his body. A screen in front of him flickered to life, showing Wells, or a version of him. "You were never human, David." Wells' voice said, cold and mechanical. "You're a simulation, designed to test a gate, and you failed again." David felt his world crumble. He wasn't David Smith. He never had been. He was a construct, an artificial intelligence built to explore the gate, trapped in an endless cycle of tests. The alien world was just a simulation within a simulation, and the whispers, they were the programmers tweaking his mind. He looked at the badge, now blank, and realized he had no true memories, only the ones they had given him. The screen showed Wells smiling. "We'll reset the cycle. Maybe next time you'll be more useful." The room darkened, and David, or what was left of him, felt his consciousness fade, knowing he'd wake again, believing he was human, only to repeat it all once more. And so, the gate kept calling, not to humans, but to echoes of something that never existed, trapped in an endless experiment where the only truth was the void.